So I'm not going to lie, that is a difficult chapter. That is a difficult chapter. It reads a bit like a phone book, doesn't it? Leaving us with either a lot of questions or screaming internally with boredom. That said, I don't think the chapter is a waste of our time. Rather, once we get a handle on the shape of the chapter or the passage, the purpose of the passage becomes clear. Once we understand the shape in which it is given to us, the purpose of it becomes more clear. And that purpose is to teach us about God's people doing godly work in God's way with a godly attitude. That is what our passage is about. God's people doing godly work in God's way with a godly attitude. So let's begin. The careful record and preservation of these names tell us that we are dealing with real people. They're not imaginary. They are real people in history, God's people who were highly esteemed within their own community. These people were loved within their own community. And how so, you might ask? Perhaps think about this list of names as names that you might find inscribed at the Auckland War Memorial. Walls and walls are filled with names after names after names with those highly esteemed soldiers, heroes of our people. People who answered the call to sacrifice, courage, and bravery. And to this day, we honor them, hoping that our children and grandchildren would still do the same in generations to come. The seemingly endless names of chapter 2 is similar to that. The names in Ezra chapter 2 were the heroes of Ezra's generation. They were the heroes. People who answered the call of God, showing courage and bravery in their generation. Of this we know from the previous chapter, that God called a people and then stirred them to some task of bravery and courage. There in the previous chapter it was said, "Then rose the heads of the fathers' houses, everyone whose spirit God had stirred, to go up, to build or rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem." This is one reason why we have this meticulous record of names. It serves as a reminder of God's people, individual names, individual people who were stirred to faithful obedience. And keeping their memory alive, keeping their names alive within their community would perhaps stir God's people in subsequent generations to also answer God's call to bravery and courage and faithful obedience, because they would look up to them as heroes, hoping that they might emulate something of their faithful obedience also. In this way, isn't it good that we have honorable heroes? Have you had an honorable hero that you've looked up to in your life? They may have changed over time, but you've had heroes. I've had heroes, people that I thought were worth knowing about, reading about, studying about. We look up to them because we honor their efforts and their achievements. And that can be a tremendous encouragement to each and every one of us. That's why autobiographies of faithful Christians are worth reading. I commend it to you. I commend to you to look up the names of faithful heroes in the faith. As we read about Christians who answered God's call and lived in faithful obedience to the Lord, it does invigorate us to press into our own faithful obedience more deeply. In this regard, I'm reminded of an insight from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, he said this. He said, "Since it is so likely that children will meet cruel enemies, let them at least have heard of brave knights and heroic courage. The names given to us in Ezra chapter 2 are the brave knights. They are the brave knights of that generation, the people of God who answered the call to faithful obedience and would then hopefully go on to inspire faithfulness in subsequent generations also. Structurally then, we know that the chapter focuses our attention on God's people. We are dealing with God's people in this chapter. But the chapter also goes on to mention their godly work. It's God's people doing godly work. It's a task that they eagerly pursued for the glory of God. And that task was to re-establish faithful worship at the temple. It's God's people doing a godly work, and that work was to re-establish faithful worship at the temple. You notice this about midway through the chapter. It's easy to miss, but let me just point you in that direction. And midway through the chapter, the whole focus of the chapter shifts from a general list of names of people who would immigrate from Babylonia back to Jerusalem to those who would lead the re-establishment of faithful worship at the temple. The shift happens somewhere around verse 36, where we are all of a sudden introduced to the priests, the Levites, the temple musicians, the temple guards, and the temple servants. All kinds of people who would give themselves not only to the tremendously important work of rebuilding and resettling the region of their forefathers, but specifically to the work of serving in the re-establishment of faithful worship. Surely, this narrowing of focus tells us the godly work of re-establishing faithful worship at the temple would be a central feature and a formative practice among those God stirred to faithful obedience. The sheer fact that the chapter gives that much attention to the temple workers tells us that being faithful in worship was going to be exceedingly important and formative for the people of God who would go back to live in Jerusalem. So that's something to say about God's people now doing godly work. But as we think about that, it's not hard to imagine that resettling the region and rebuilding the temple would have been a monstrous task. You're in a generation that has been living in Babylon for some 70 years, and King Cyrus is raised up and he says, you're allowed to go back. You can go and rebuild what we took from you. It is an enormous task ahead of you. Enormous. Go and rebuild what was once destroyed. It is an enormous task, a huge collective effort requiring all hands on deck to get the job done. And faced with the sheer scale of the work ahead, I suppose it could have been quite easy for the planners and the leaders of that effort to get caught up in the rush and the excitement of what needs to be done, throwing every volunteer at the task. The task is big and many hands make light work, we might think to ourselves, right? There's a big job to be done. Whoever is willing, get at it. That's how we would normally think about these things. But here too, the chapter offers us a very important lesson, and I'd like you to pay attention to this. The chapter not only demonstrates God's people doing a godly work, but it also shows us that they paid attention to doing the godly work in a godly way. Doing the godly work in a godly way. Well, I'm sure the collective excitement of being told you're allowed to go back and rebuild for yourself, rise from the ruins in an ancient city, the sheer excitement of that prospect would have drawn people from both inside and outside the Israelite community to offer their services and offer their expertise in all kinds of ways, lending a hand. It's instructive for us to notice that not every volunteer was eligible or welcomed to every aspect of the work. Not every volunteer was given equal access to every aspect of the work. There were certain jobs that remained off limits or restricted, and such is the case for those who wanted to serve as priests in the temple of God. Here's how it plays out for us in the passage. Many generations before this one that Ezra is writing to, many generations before, God had stipulated certain criteria for serving in the Judaic temple. In order to be a priest, you had to be from the Levitical family. And while those outside of the Levitical family could serve the community in all kinds of honorable and worthy ways, they could not serve as priests. Only the Levitical family could serve in the priesthood of the Judaic temple. That was a specific requirement of God's law. Now think about this. Ezra's community, the returning exiles, could either notice that law and be obedient to it or disobedient to it, right? The job ahead is massive. And God says that certain parts of the job can only be done by certain people. So they could either look at God's law and respond obediently or disobediently to the mountain of work ahead of them. Remember, they were tasked to rebuild their social order from the ground up. And the temptation would be to throw every volunteer unscreened at the work, but thereby risking repeating the mistakes of their forefathers, which was to slip into unfaithful disobedience to God's law. All these returning exiles could be more careful, and though there was lots of work to be done, they could screen the workers in order to preserve faithful obedience to God's commandments. And by the looks of it, Ezra's generation chose the latter. They chose the latter. They chose faithful obedience. Verse 59 picks up on this. The following were those who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Aden, and Immer, though they could not prove their fathers' houses or their descent, whether they belonged to Israel. These sought registration amongst those enrolled in the genealogies, but they were not found there, and so they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. So just to recap, a good number of people may have wanted to join the buzz. It's the new and cool thing to do. You're going back to Jerusalem. You're going to be rebuilding your social order from the ground up. You're given a fresh start. You've got all the resources you could dream of to do this with. It's all go. The green lights are everywhere. Everyone wants to be part of the buzz of rebuilding and re-establishing faithful worship at the temple, even to serve as priests. But for one or other reason, their family records proving their ties to the Levitical family were lost. Somewhere between the move between Babylonia and Jerusalem, their family records were lost, misplaced. Think of this perhaps like losing your birth certificate if you've ever moved houses. You put it away somewhere, but you don't have no idea where when it comes to the unpacking job. Or maybe those of you who have traveled, think of this as perhaps misplacing your passport. You know where you're from. You know what your birth certificate says. You know what's on your passport. But in the moment, when you can't prove it to anyone else, it's very hard to make your case, isn't it? It's very hard to show who you really are. And this is the situation some of the returning exiles found themselves in. They were eager to volunteer their services, but to carelessly enlist them in the temple service would quickly cause a new generation who was so eager to walk in faithful obedience to go astray in regards to God's commandments. As such, and here's the lesson, as such, the faithful planners and leaders wisely slowed down the decision-making process. They just slowed it all down to a crawl. And this is the very applicable lesson for all of us. Sometimes we see lots of godly work that could be done, and we are often desperate for the manpower, but we must act wisely, which sometimes means acting cautiously. Amongst Ezra's generation, this meant enlisting temple workers who would further the cause of faithful obedience, but it would also mean holding back on those who weren't clearly identifiable as suited to temple service. Sometimes it's okay to slow down in order to lead well. To put this another way, this is a lesson in prioritizing principles, that is, doing what is right, over pragmatics, doing what will work. Principles has to do with acting on conviction. Pragmatics has to do with compromise. Acting on principles helps us to be faithful. Acting on pragmatics focuses us on obtaining the desired outcome by any means necessary. And given the mountain of work ahead to the Israelites, resettling the region and rebuilding their temple, it is highly instructive that being principled really mattered to that generation. It mattered doing the right thing, even if it meant a smaller workforce for temple service. This is a good lesson for us to learn. God's people doing godly work is done best when we do the godly work in God's way, when we favor principles over pragmatics. The last thing I'd like for us to see in this passage is this. Even though the passage tells us about God's people doing godly work in God's way, we also see that their efforts were done with a godly attitude. God's people doing godly work in God's way with a godly attitude. For this, I'm looking to verse 68. Some of the heads of the families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, made freewill offerings for the house of God to erect it on its site. I am making a point here about their attitude because attitude matters. God's people doing the right thing on its own might pass for appearances, but doing the right thing with the right attitude makes a world of difference. It makes a world of difference. Many moons ago, a well-known pastor, John Piper, gave a fairly famous illustration that captures this idea of doing godly work with the right attitude very well. He said, imagine it's a wedding anniversary and a husband picks a beautiful bouquet of flowers. He returns home and he knocks on his door, expecting his wife to greet him as she opens the door to him. And he presents to her the beautiful bouquet of flowers on their anniversary. She smiles and she loves the gesture. She says to him, "You shouldn't have." And he kind of dawdles and looks at his feet and he dispassionately says, "Well, it's my duty. I have to do it." See, the husband did the right thing, giving his wife flowers on their anniversary, but he did it the wrong way, with a stink attitude. And that ruins the whole gesture, doesn't it? Even though you're doing the right thing, doing it with a bad attitude ruins the whole enterprise. And that's what I think our text is so careful to show us is not happening amongst the faithful who were rebuilding and re-establishing God's people in Jerusalem. True, they were God's people doing God's work in a godly way, but to top it off, they were doing all of this with a godly attitude. They wanted to do it for the right reasons and with the right attitude. And verse 69 points this out to us. It tells us the heads of houses, according to their ability, gave to the treasury of the work 61,000 derricks of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priests' garments. We don't measure things like that anymore, but just for reference, this amounts to about a half ton of gold, about 3 tons of silver, and quite a lot of bespoke clothing. It's a lot that they were giving. And we're not even quite sure how the exiles came into all of this wealth, but it seems that much of this wealth that they were contributing to the temple came to them as gifts from their friends and neighbors back in Babylonia. Their friends and neighbors sent them with generous gifts to go and do the work to which God had called them to do. In the previous chapter, Cyrus decreed, let each survivor, that's speaking of the exiles that were now going back to Jerusalem, let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold. They received gifts by which to go, and when they get there, they pass on these gifts to the work of God. These much needed resources to support a godly work done in God's way with a godly attitude. So then, having taken some time to think through the shape of the chapter, we have hopefully seen a glimpse of these 4 points. Here in history, we have an exemplary moment in which God's people did godly work in God's way with a godly attitude. And these are very important to every generation of believers, even our own, that we would emulate their example and walk in their footsteps. But for this chapter and for the Christian, we are also enticed to look beyond ancient Israel to the true Israelite. This is not just a history lesson in what Ezra did, it is a foretaste for us to look to the true Israelite, Jesus Christ. Jesus is truly God's person. He is truly the person of God, of whom it is said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And this Jesus is faithful to the utmost, declaring, "I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." He is the truly faithful Israelite. And this Jesus, being God's faithful person, did so in God's way. The scriptures say that he, in every respect, has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. God's person doing godly work in God's way. He did it without sin. And he did all of this with a fitting attitude. All of this was done by Christ with a fitting attitude. Thus it is written, for the joy, and that's the attitude, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Ezra chapter 2, with all its complexities of names and numbers, do give us some taste for Jesus. Ezra's generation were given a sampling, a taste of what a truly faithful Israelite would be like. Someone who belongs to God, doing godly work in God's way with a godly attitude. But the only shoulders on whom that mantle fits perfectly is Jesus Christ's. And so I commend him to you for your hope and for your joy. I invite you to marvel at him, give thanks for his perfect faithfulness, even as we learn our baby steps of imitating him in the same way. Let's pray together and think about what we have heard this morning.